Okay. So I just wanted to touch back on your process on how you write. If you outline, use a typewriter, use cards, listen to any kind of music, what is your, do you have a routine with your process?
I mean, I wouldn't call it yeah, it's sort of a routine, I guess. I'll kind of work from like 10 to 6, something like that. I play music. I'll generally fixate on a particular song that has absolutely maybe no relevance to what I'm doing whatsoever. Just something about it stays in my head, and I'll just write with that music. When I first started writing, you had a vinyl, so you had to put the thing on, and every 3 minutes you have to keep getting back to that same spot, to that particular thing. And of course, then later on with, iTunes and Spotify, you can lock onto something and just let it keep repeating over and over again.
But not even, you mean a song, not
A song.
even an album?
No, song. And so sometimes I'll look and I'll say, well, how many times did I listen? Well, 193 times, one particular song. Just whatever it is about it stays in my head. So if I were to think about Diner, I played Pete Townshend's Rough Boys over and over and over and over again. Doesn't apply to Diner, but there's something about it that I liked. And so it gives me a certain energy to just go.
I know the song well.
Yeah.
And is the process at all different between television and film? Do you have to get into sort of a different mindset for one or the other, or?
No, I mean, I never wrote as much. I mean, the television stuff I did was more in the sketch area, and features are more, longer form. But it's what are you doing, and how do you want to approach it? So, features. Then you had more flexibility. Now, television has more flexibility. You can have longer form, etc. It's not like at 2.5 hours is, like the top. You can write. All what you're seeing now is this explosion of changing the whole form, right? So, and it evolves in a lot of different ways because it's part of the evolution of how we want to see things. So if we want to watch 9 hours of a particular show over several days, that's the way we're going to watch it. There's entertainment has to continue to evolve and change. It's like sketch comedy has to evolve and change. And initially it was connected to, going back to vaudeville and burlesque, and here's a sketch and blah, 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 and there's a song, and then, here's a sketch, and, and then it keeps changing. Laugh-In went to one thing, and other things, and the Pythons did this, and it just keeps evolving. So all form will always change.
And we're going to talk about that real specifically later with what you're doing now on television. But I want to just go back to some films. So after Diner, you were able to direct someone else's script, Rain Man, in '83, and won an Oscar for it. Can you talk about how that came about and how that impacted your career?
Well, Rain Man was '88.
Sorry, '88,
yeah. Well, I mean, if you win an Academy Award, it's one of those awards that you go, oh, well, this is something. This is nice. But it always gets back to, I'll give you the surrounding circumstances of Rain Man, because it involves Sidney Pollack and Michael Ovitz. Michael Ovitz called me up and said, Sidney Pollack is going to direct, Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise, and he's having some problems with the script, and you know him, reasonably well. It goes all the way back to, when Diner's opening and Tootsie when we began to talk. And so I said, okay. And so I read the script, and on the way, I was going to Palm Springs. And on the way to Palm Springs, I'm telling the story to my wife Diana and another couple, and I'm talking about it. we passed through those big windmills.
Yeah.
I said, it'd be like, he's going down the road and there's a windmills there, and et cetera. And I'm telling the whole story. And so Diana said, well, you should direct it. I said, I'm not directing this. Sidney Pollack's doing it. I'm just reading it and going to talk to him about it and give him some thoughts. And I got there and I called Sidney and I said, look, I had read the script and, I think it could be good. And I laid out some of the thoughts that I had. And he wasn't sure, and Diana kept saying, this sounds like something you should direct. I said, no, I'm not directing it. Sidney's doing it. And I told him about certain things. And a couple days later, Ovitz called me and said, Sidney is, dropping out. He can't see his way. He doesn't know where to go. And it was literally like 7 weeks before they're going to start principal photography. 7, 8 weeks, something like that. And so he asked me if I would be interested in directing it. And I I had some, I was interested because I had some ideas that seemed that were workable. But I met with Dustin and Tom, and I told them some things to it. And that's how I got involved in it. That was the beginning of that.
And was there any particular things you recall about working with Dustin Hoffman and working with him on that role, of being someone who's autistic?
Well, what it was I had a great time with both. And because we were shooting in continuity, because we going from Cincinnati to L.A., we're not in L.A., then we're here, we're going back and forth in the script. We were literally following the whole continuity of it. So it benefited by the fact that the more we learned, the more that you can integrate that into the piece as you go along. And so the relationships become a little bit more complex, and you can find your way in that regard. Hold on 1 second. Sure. So as an example, Dustin calls me up one day and he said, when Raymond gets anxious, it says in the script, that he goes into a pitching motion and he's doing a pitching motion and winding up and throwing the ball. And it takes too long to do it. I said, well, let me see. So he said, so I'm anxious and I got to go do it. And he said, I don't know, it takes too long. I don't know how to do that. So I could see, that's a problem. It's an actor having how do I do something? And the mechanics of it are a problem. And, it's always worthwhile when an actor is struggling with something is to at least examine what it is rather than saying, no, it's going to be fine or whatever. We'll put the camera over here, it'll all work. Is to try to figure out what it is about it and what does that mean? And so I kept thinking about it. Well, it's a whole physical motion. It takes too long. And if he's sitting, he's got to stand. And so I can understand that. So I got this idea. So I call him up. I said, what happens when you get anxious? You do who's on first? He said, what do you mean, the Abbott and Costello thing? I said, yeah, you do that. And he says, well, who's playing the other guy? I said, you just say the whole thing, like a mantra. And I said, look, who's on first? The first baseman. That's what I said to first baseman. Who's on first? The first baseman. Who? But who's the first baseman? I said, you do it like a mantra. You don't know what's funny. It has nothing to do with it, but there's a rhythm. And if you do it in that way, it's like it can settle him down. So he tried that, and that seemed to solve that. So that's what we'll do. Now, because we did it, and we're shooting in continuity, so when we do it early, and then in a scene later on, I said, well, this might be a good place to do the who's on first, It's when he gets the highway, the accident, and, starts doing that mantra, who's on first. We'll try it here, and we'll do this. And so the piece evolved, going back to the fact that, I came out of improvisation in acting school. I studied acting, but I did a lot of improvisational stuff. I did a lot of improvisational when we were writing initially sketches. And so I used that improvisational aspects throughout the film. So there are scenes that are built just on a very simple idea. And once you can get the actors up and going, like I said to Tom one day, I said, we have to let the audience know that although Charlie is disconnected to his brother, at least he makes some effort to pay attention to him, to help him, you know. So like he gives him fresh underwear. You know, it's a small thing, but he gives him that. And then that becomes a problem. And I said, and for you, Dustin, it's not the underwear you would have, therefore you can't wear that underwear. And we get the underwear from, you know, Kmart, you know. And so we did a take, you know, going down the road. I said, now, why don't we think of it this way? This is not a conversation that's going to end in 2 minutes, like a normal conversation. This conversation could literally go from here to LA. This is a good conversation for Raymond, and he'll just keep coming back to the same thing. And at a certain point, Charlie's going to get more and more exasperated because he can't convince him. And that's what you are. You're a salesperson, and you can't convince the other person. It would start to drive you crazy. So we did that scene, and we built it where he wants to go back to, you know, Cincinnati, to the place. I got to get the thing and whatever. Underwear's underwear. You know, I got to go to Cincinnati, and we built that. And that's how you take those two characters and those very seemingly inconsequential things is the building blocks of the piece. And that's how Charlie is going to begin to understand his brother, that he can't con him. You can't win him. You can't be a salesperson to him. You're going to have to deal with his issues in a way that can't be just that superficial way of doing it. And then he's going to, in a sense, the character's going to have to turn inside out in a way until he begins to find his own humanity. That'll be the journey across country, without talking in lofty terms. You know, just let's do this. You know, so then you start to go that way, and that's how you build it. So certain things come out of with a film. The production designer one day said, well, you know, they'd be on Interstate 80 if they want to get to LA as fast as they can. I said, well, the highway is boring. It looks too boring to me. He said, well, how else are we going to go? And I said, well, it's no good. We'll be on a highway. It won't be nothing to look at. And then I said later in the day, I tell you what, so we're on 80, let's stage a traffic accident, you know, cars overturned, paramedics, lights, things, whatever, and when they pull up and Raymond sees flashing lights and everything else, he's out of the car. He is never going down that highway. He's never going to get back in that car until you get off that highway, and Charlie is never going to convince him to stay in the car. And that became a scene, which is no more than what I'm telling you, and that got him off the highway. And now you can have it look more visually more interesting, because then it looks better. Oh, look at that, that's nicer. It's more interesting than an interstate highway, but at the same time, it served the character, and it wasn't gratuitous. It made sense. He will not get in that car. And so you go around the cloverleaf, and when he finally we're off, then he'll get in the car. And he'll be mumbling who's on first the whole time until that time. And that will serve the production problem of boring highway and furthering the conflict between Charlie's going to have with Raymond. And Raymond is going to exert more and more of his influence because that's the rituals and what he understands and the fears and the anxieties that he has.
And with this approach and this sort of freedom you're describing, maybe coming from improv, you were confident you could close the loop, but was there ever a circumstance on any of the films where the improv got away from you and you didn't know how to remedy? Or is it always coming out?
No, it was never going to be like, well, let's just do this and somehow we'll have to figure it out. Somehow you have to know where do you want to get to? Otherwise, an improv will go all over the place, and then it becomes, you know, humorous at times, but it sort of lacks some direction. Then I think it'll wear on itself. Mm-hmm. But here it's very specific in that regard. I'm sorry. So I think that's the key thing you have to work on when you're doing improvisational material and moments that you want to develop because you know where you want to get to. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to have surprises, but you know where you want to get to.
You worked on several films with Robin Williams. Good Morning Vietnam, I think, was the next film after Rain Man. And Before, and then Toys. I'm wondering how you were able to rein him in on, getting from A to B.
Yeah, well, you don't have to rein him in, as long as you, in other words, the improv stuff that we did was based on sometimes certain problems in this regard. He's teaching a class, and they're going to ask him questions. And when we would try to do it, the actors, the Vietnamese, the Thai actors, never sounded convincing to me when they would do the lines. I never bought it. It didn't sound right to my ear. So what I thought I needed to do is let them speak for themselves and let them ask the questions. And let's set it up so that their behavior is going to come through, and then you can ask them questions, and then they're going to have to come up with an answer to what you asked them. And so what I said to Robin, I'm not going to slate the scene. Why don't we just start having a conversation? Here's what we got to get to in this. But let's start a conversation. And when at a certain time, I'll just give hand signals and the camera will start rolling, and then that's how we'll build it. So they never knew when we were shooting or whatever, because we never slayed it. We would only tail slate. So if Robin started talking to somebody about it, and then they started to go on to it, and then he might ask a question about this, and then that's how it built, so that it seemed as natural as it can. And that to me was the best way to get those actors to be as comfortable as possible and not suddenly saying some lines that are written that don't quite fit the way they would talk. And that's what we did. And Robin was good enough to allow them to express themselves and then answer certain questions which would take it somewhere else, because they say some really fascinating things. And it became a way of working, and he was very good with them. So as an example, in Good Morning Vietnam, the one character came up to me, and we had these like melons, and where they're going to play, they're going to play ball, right? Play baseball. And he came up to me, he says, I have seen a real baseball or something like, with my own eyes, and this is not, like a baseball. And he was telling me this. And I said to him, look, I'm not in charge of the equipment. You know what I mean? You're going to have to talk to who's in charge of the equipment. And he said, and who shall I speak to, or something like that. I said, you have to talk to Robin. Robin's in charge of all the equipment. So he says, I shall do that. He was very proud of the way he spoke. So I just literally whispered to Robin, passing on by, he's going to come over and ask you, he's got problems with the melons not being right. You just have to deal with them. And then I walked off, and I just gave a hand signal when the camera person came up on it. And he was asking about the issue with the melons and the baseballs, the softballs, whatever. And that's what that was. Yeah. So you are doing improv, but you were advancing this in terms of how they deal with one another and the sensibility, to be in another part of the world and interacting with them. And that's how that sequence grew. Mm. So I never told any of the actors when we're going to play the game how the game works. You know what I mean? So I said, like first, second, third base, I didn't explain any of it. And we had a couple MPs, and if you ever watch closely, I said to the MPs, if they start running the wrong way, just go get them and indicate you got to go this way. And so it was a bit of like a wild free-for-all, but that added to the enjoyment of it, rather than I'm the second baseman, I'm the whatever. And so and out of it, you're able to have this kind of interaction of characters and culture. And that's the point to get to.
Now we're skipping a lot of things, unfortunately, but I do want to get to Homicide. And what attracted you to doing a television project at that point in your career in '93?
Well, I always wanted to, I always liked television, so I didn't have any bias like some people. Well, you know, you're doing film now, you don't do TV. But I always liked television. I always thought television could do certain things that features can't do. And so I got the book, David Simon's book, Homicide, Life on the Street. Or, no, I think it was originally called A Year in the Killing Street or something like that. And it was something that way. Mm-hmm. NBC thought it was too dark. So Life on the Street seemed to be reaffirming to them. And so I was given it, and I thought, well, this is a really terrific piece, but I don't know how you're going to cut this down to 2 hours. So I said, why can't we make this a series? And it'll be about a homicide squad and how they have to deal with death on a regular basis. And this is a squad. And so it's not an action story where we're chasing the bad guys or whatever. There's a murder, and you got to try to deal with it. Mm-hmm. And their personal lives that get mixed into the whole thing. That was basically it. I thought it had value as a TV series, much more so than a feature.
Yeah. When we spoke with Tom Fontana, who I want to ask you about working with, he had some hesitation about doing anything after Hill Street Blues, even approaching the cop genre. So, and you know, when you described it, no car chases, no gun battles. I mean, how did you even pitch this to the network in a way that you thought that this was really going to work as a compelling?
Well, every so often, you get lucky in this regard. I made a deal with NBC to do 6 episodes of something, of which there would be no network involvement in terms of content or casting. And so I had these 6 episodes of something. They could not make it, and, you know, and then they just have to pay off and whatever. And Brandon Tartikoff was the head of the network at that point. And I told him about the piece and whatever, and he thought that was really interesting and was excited by it. And I kind of laid it out, you know, literally in a conversation, not with like papers and pages of, and then this, and then Pembleton's going to become that, and blah, 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 you know, like they do now. You know, it was, here, this is what it can be. And he said, that sounds good. It sounds great. And so we literally went off and did that. You know, I brought Tom Fontana into it, and Paul Attanasio did the initial pilot script, and I'd worked with Paul. I think there's a few films that we had done on, you know, with Baltimore Pictures at that point in time, and so he came in and did the pilot for it, and then, you know, then the show evolved as we went forward, you know, as television should. As you keep doing it, you start discovering it. And very early on, I think it was the first episode that we shot, and there was a sequence in what they call the box, the Q&A type of thing. And Andre Braugher was so good. He was so compelling. I said to Tom, literally while we were shooting, I said, we should do a whole episode in a box. The whole episode is in the box rather than what we're doing here. Just see if we can pull it off. And he said, you really? I mean, you know, I said, no, it's in the box. The whole episode, basically. We may go out for a minute, but the show is in the box. What happened, trying to get to it. And then he wrote that episode. And then that became part of the unpredictable nature of Homicide. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, we sort of survived every year.
Mm-hmm. Talk about directing the pilot, and oftentimes that will just establish the tone for the rest of the series. Can you talk a little bit about the choices you made for the jump cuts and the shooting style? On
well, what happened was you have to think 2 things. One is they say, all right, so it takes place in Baltimore, but we're not going to Baltimore. It's cost too much. Mm. And, you know, you can go there for second unit. And I went, I don't know how to do that. It wouldn't feel right for the show. So in terms of budget, you say, well, then how do we shoot on location and keep the budget down and et cetera? Which led me to think of, why not shoot it with a Super 16 camera, and we'll do all handheld, and we won't do any of the other stuff, so we can be as lean as possible. If we're going to get into a squad car, we just get into a squad car and we shoot. We don't do camera mounts. We don't do anything. Well, that's it. If we're going into a house, we've got the basic lighting, and then we just shoot. And we can shoot 360 from that point on, and you're not just simply going over the shoulder, 2 shots, so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. You're not, you don't, you go in and you just shoot it. And you cover it in continuous takes each time. So if it's a 3-minute scene, you do a 3 minutes of that, and then they'll go about what they're doing, and now the camera will start in a different way and start to put it together, and that's how it got built. And because the show didn't have any real action, and I thought that we needed to create the energy so that the camera, in a sense, created the energy, and the jump cuts give it this raggedness so it feels more real, and then that would be our energy. It's unsettling at times. It jumps in the way it's doing it, rather than finessed and all the way things are more manicured than that. And that would be the style of the show.
Mm-hmm. But it was essential for you to shoot it in Baltimore.
Yeah, if you want to do a show that somehow is going to really, and I, in a sense, I'm sort of one of the shows when I was a kid that I loved was Naked City, which was shot on the streets of New York. And as a kid, I thought, oh, it's fantastic. You know, they're pulling up in neighborhoods and things, and it looks so, it's so real and everything. And that was sort of in my head when I began to think of, let's do it like Naked City in a sense of really on location. If car pulls up, going into the house, that's the house. The house is not going to be built elsewhere on some stage. It'll all be practical, and we'll go from there.
Now, as EP, did you have a hand in the casting process? Were you involved with that?
Yep.
So can you talk about how you cast those roles with Andre Braugher and Belzer?
Yeah, all of them. It happens you just see certain people or you know certain people, and you can think, I saw Andre in something, I can't remember what it was. I thought, well, he's a great actor. And, fortunately, that worked out. For Belzer, I heard on the Howard Stern show. And I liked the rhythm of the way he spoke. And because we were looking at some other actors, and when I heard him, I said, why don't we find out about Richard Belzer? I heard him on Howard Stern. I like the rhythm of the way he talks, so that's how that happened. And the roles got filled in that way. Mm-hmm. You never can explain casting. You somehow, you think a person should be this way, and then somebody comes in, they're totally different, you go, oh, that seems quite interesting.
With the way you were shooting it, did the actors always know if they were on camera?
No, they didn't know. They didn't know anything other than, here we are, and now we're shooting, and that's why they had to stay on their game, because you never knew when the camera was coming to you or it wasn't coming to you. Because it's not like I'm off camera for this whole sequence. The camera's moving around. So they were like continuous, those scenes, if you're in a basement of something and the scene is 2.5 minutes long or whatever it is, that's how long the take will be.
Describing how you were, wanted to keep that energy going with the jump cuts and all of that. Were you yourself involved in the post-production and the editing of that?
Initially, to lay it out, because I remember having an editor, and he was a good editor, but he couldn't deal with the idea of jumping screen direction. And so I'd look at something, I said, well, that's not the way it should go together. It looks too manicured and it loses its energy. And I just couldn't convey that. Just jump it. just jump screen direction. That'll become the element. And I can't remember how it happened. It was Jay Rabinowitz, who's a young editor, and I met with him and we spoke, and I tried to explain it, and then he came in and he got it, right away. And that was the pattern. So that you wanted to suddenly, you start to say the line here and it jumps like that, and that sort of becomes part of its form. Mm-hmm. Its raggedness becomes part of its design.
Now you had your 6 that they were under contract to give you. What was the reaction from NBC when they saw what you had shot? Initially.
It was, it was mixed, but they saw the potential, and so we had 6, and then we ended up getting 7 more, and then we ended up this, and then we may not come back, and then we didn't come back, and then we came back for another year. It was like, and then at a certain point we sort of established ourselves. But there was, anytime you're doing something that's that far outside of what's being done, you're always going to have a certain amount of opposition. It just comes with the territory.
You have any great network notes you remember?
No. They let us do, to NBC's credit, to Warren Littlefield, who took over, to his credit, is that we literally did just about anything we wanted to do in terms of storytelling. Period. We were literally, even though we'd have our arguments and everything else, he was good in that respect, that we basically did the show that we wanted to do. And so it's funny, the only time they said no, and now it seems kind of crazy, they said, why don't we do one whole episode? And the whole episode will be during some rock concert that goes on from all day into the night. And somebody is killed and there's a homicide, and while the whole concert is going on, they're trying to find the killer in this situation. And so this band's playing, and then we'll have that band, and we'll do this thing, and the whole episode for the 1 hour is all against music. A lot of times we won't even hear what they're saying because they'll get drowned out by it, but we'll know that they're now heading over here and they think the killer is there, and we'll do that with all this music. That was the only time they went, no, you've gone too far. It's too crazy. Nobody cares about music, in a drama. It's not needed, and that was the only time that we lost the fight.
Maybe it was a licensing issue? Was it
No, it was the idea of music. It's a drama show, and now you got all this music going on.
Right. But that's another one where the genre of drama maybe didn't fit always. There was all these other personal human moments in it, and comedic moments.
Yeah.
So now that show had an interesting thing with the crossover character that I'm not sure how many times that's been done, with Richard Belzer's character Munch going to SVU.
I don't know that it's ever been done.
Right.
It happened because we did those episodes with them where their characters were in Homicide, or Homicide was in there. There was a few of those.
Yeah, how'd that come about?
I don't remember. I don't remember the details. Dick Wolf had that, and I don't remember how. It could have been, Warren Littlefield. I'm not sure who. It could have been Dick Wolf. I don't know whose idea it was. What about if we mixed the characters in for an episode? Might be fun.
Was there ever any legal concerns about who owns the character when he actually left Homicide, went over to SVU?
I think we obviously would have owned Munch, because Munch was part of Homicide. So we technically would have owned it, and probably, if we wanted to put up a stink about it, then we probably could have killed it and said, no, you can't take our character into another series. But what's the point? Let him, when Homicide ended and he went off to that, well, why not?
Yeah. Homicide had another interesting thing, really ahead of its time, with the second shift, with the online component. Yeah. Did you have anything to do with that?
Not as much as the show itself. But yeah, there was a few little experimental things, and that was probably ahead of its time too. The idea of trying to use the internet and all that stuff was a little too in front of what finally came to be.
I want to just talk about Tom Fontana and what it was like working with him, and if you were there for the shooting of the opening sequence, the opening credits.
The opening credits.
With the tattoo.
Oh, in terms of Oz.
Oh, sorry, yeah, that's Oz.
Yeah, that was Oz.
But let's talk about Tom Fontana for just what was your relationship like with him? How was he to work with?
Well, you know, I didn't know him at all. He was recommended. I met him. I think we hit it off. I think we had a similar sensibility, how the show should, you know, go. And that was just the beginning of a relationship that's gone on now for, you know, over 20 years.
Yeah.
So there's a shorthand to a lot of it. It wasn't like, well, no, I don't understand or whatever. We sort of clicked in that regard in terms of what the image of it would be. Not necessarily this moment or this moment, but what is it? How does this work? What kind of stories? I think we had the same interest in that regard.
Mm. Why did the show come to an end?
Well, we ran 7 years. You know, we had 120 some episodes or whatever. So that was probably, you know, that's a long, successful run.
Do you think there's a lasting legacy for that show in terms of television or the genre?
Well, I mean, I think it was, you know, we broke a lot of the rules and the forms and the handheld stuff. I mean, I've spoken to, you know, some British directors that said when they saw the show and everything else that it actually started to influence the way they were shooting things, you know, post, you know, Homicide, that kind of slightly ragged or slightly handheld thing, which hadn't been done that way before that. So, you know, it has its influences. It's all things that come along, you know, that, you know, start to redefine a moment. And, you know, you'll see if you were to track things like, oh, that started then and then this happened, or whatever show it was or whatever film it was, you know, there's a place where certain things evolve from. And you never can predict what those things are.
So let's jump to Oz. 1997, you executive produced that as well, and this was now HBO, so you're off network. Mm-hmm. How did that show come together and come about?
Tom had the idea, and we went to HBO, and it seems like a simpler time, because it literally was, well, this is it. Well, why don't we just go shoot like a 10-minute, you know, piece for it, you know, and we went off and they shot that little thing, and then literally like, all right, let's do it, and that became the first HBO, I think it's the first HBO series.
It's the first drama, yeah. I mean, the state of HBO at the time was mostly just movies.
Yeah. Chris Albrecht literally off the pitch said, okay, go do this. We did the 10-minute thing, and let's do it. And then it went on the air.
I heard you were actually in the room with him when he watched it. Was that unusual?
It was. I mean, it feels like another world then, you know what I mean? But that's how simple things were. Here, take a look. See what you think, Chris. You know, I like this. Good. Let's go ahead with this. That you know what I mean? It was that sort of like handmade in a way. Here, what do you think? It's not like it had to go to a lot of people or all this stuff. It was very simple. Mm-hmm. And even in terms of, you know, NBC, in terms of Homicide, there weren't a whole lot of people that you spoke to. You know, you dealt with just a couple people. And that was the line of communication, and there wasn't teams of executives. There was very few people involved.
Did you and Tom have, what was the pitch for the show? How would you describe it? How did you describe it to Chris of what you wanted to do and how it was different from what you had done before?
Well, it was certainly different from anything we'd done before, but it was a prison show that would be much tougher than what you've seen, you know, with a real edge to it, as opposed to, you know, men behind bars that had been, you know, much more sanitized. So that was the aspect of it.
Okay, now I'll ask the question I asked before about the opening sequence. How did that happen that it was Tom?
I didn't know.
That.
I wasn't there when that was done, and it was only after the fact when I said, "Are you crazy? You know what I mean? This thing could be on and off, and that'll be the end of this thing."
Describe what he did.
Because he did the tattoo of Oz on his arm for the where the guy's getting the tattoo Oz, on his arm, and I said, what happens to the show? Then you got this tattoo, and people will be asking you, what is Oz? What is Oz? Fortunately, the show lasted.
Was he just that invested in it? Or was it there was no one else to give an arm?
He was excited about it, so he lent his arm to it. Fortunately, he didn't do it on some of the other ones, because some of the failed pilots. Otherwise, he'd be filled with tattoos of people not going, what was that? Well, it was a show. It didn't work out.
How involved were you as the EP in the day-to-day production of the show?
In the beginning, you spend more time, and then once it's up and running and everybody kind of knows what they're doing, then you'll hear the storylines and whatever, and and you're not following it on a day-by-day basis. It's like if it's up and running and Tom ran that show, and he had the staff was very good and everybody was in sync, and you know what you're doing, and that's the pleasure of sometimes when you have partnership where you're bickering over every little thing. You know it's in good hands, and you know how it's supposed to progress, and then you'll have some larger discussions about arcs and storylines or something like that. But in some ways it seems pretty simple in terms of Homicide and Oz, in terms of how they evolved, and both of them were what you might call blatantly mainstream pieces of work.
For sure. The decision to have a narrator, how did that come about?
I don't remember. I assume it's Tom. I think Tom had to lay it out that way.
Mm-hmm. And then it was from the perspective of people who were past, right? It was a different perspective. It was there someone who was leaving the cast? I think I read that was how that initially came about.
I don't remember.
Okay. So, you kind of touched on this already about HBO seems like they gave you free reign, but did you have any censorship issues at all with that show?
I don't think so.
That's amazing.
No, I don't remember that.
There was nothing like that happening anywhere on television.
No.
With some of the content.
No, I don't remember anything. I think it was just, we're HBO, go ahead and do it.
Mm-hmm. Did it find an audience quickly?
I think it found its audience, and I think the surprising thing is that what they never expected is that we ended up having a constantly growing female audience as it went along. Originally, we thought, well, it's just a guy show. But, female audience began to grow and grow with the show.
Was there any subject matter that you were not sure would work in a TV format that you thought maybe was too
I don't
much?
remember that. I can't give you a good answer to it. I don't remember that.
Mm-hmm. So why did that show come to an end?
I don't remember. Maybe Tom does. I think we just thought it ran its course, and now you're just sort of repeating yourself and whatever. And I think that's what happened. I might be wrong. There may have been other discussions that HBO said, all right, it's time to move on. I don't know. Because I think we were actually still growing in an audience. I don't think we were like on the decline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in his interview he said he wanted to put a limit on it, but then he kind of regretted it. He thought there was a couple more seasons.
Yeah, I think we talked about that.
You feel that way too?
Yeah.
What's the legacy of Oz?
I think it could have kept going forever.
Yeah.
To be honest with you.
What do you think is the legacy of that show?
Well, it's ironic that it's the first HBO series. When you think about it, that's a giant change in the direction of HBO. Up until then, they used to show movies. And then all of a sudden they had their own series content. So what is HBO most known for now is their series, not the fact that they show movies. So, you know, Veep or Game of Thrones or, you know, all the shows that have come along, you know, in all these years.
Sopranos, yeah.
Sopranos are all series. And so it began with Oz.
Now, just briefly, I want to touch again on the films that you were working on around this time, the late 90s. There's just an interesting thing happening with Wag the Dog, Man of the Year, Hollywood. I mean, you seem to keep hitting on these political topics right before Life Imitates Art. Do you have anything to say about that, or what are your thoughts on those films? And
No,
when they happen?
it's, you know, it's. I guess it's what happens is sometimes your thought process runs in front of what'll happen, because you can almost begin to see certain things, you know. I mean, it's obviously a lot of happenstance, but if you go back to Toys, which was I thought a very misunderstood movie in its time, it basically talked about, you know, computer-generated warfare with, you know, drones, which was, you know, these remote-controlled, you know, drones that'll fly and blow things up. And, you know, kids with hand-eye coordination, you know, would be doing that, and they don't even understand the consequence because it looked like video games. That was really at the core of the piece, that the so-called, you know, innocuous computer and game can be the real warfare of the future. You know, that somehow that got lost when the movie came out.
Too soon, maybe.
And was, yeah, and it's clear. I mean, it's talked about. The general talks about that. You know, big planes cost too much. Little planes, you know, he says little planes, little things, you know, that blow up. You know, it's cheaper. It's more cost effective. But he was saying in the future that, you know, you can have children do it because they don't understand, you know, cause and effect. And so that was at it. And probably the mistake that I made is because it looked like a cute film, which I thought was the sleight of hand, and the fun of it was misunderstood as being sweet, where I was saying that was the coating on it. And underneath it, it was far darker and far more bitter. And that's what so sometimes you do something, I got, you know, truly attacked on so many levels for that film. But, you know, sometimes you hit on certain things that happen. Sometimes not, when you're trying to be contemporary to what's taking place.
Is there any impetus to do another Hollywood-type documentary with the current political climate this year?
Well, you know, somebody asked me about doing it. I said, I don't really know what to do right now. I mean, it's so crazy. I don't know where you go. I mean, we've hit the wall. We've generally hit the wall, and it's the evolution of television and media and its consequences. You know, this couldn't have happened 30 years ago, where we are right now. It couldn't have happened in that way. And so part of it is it's the times we live in, and it's the media world that has been invented. And those things didn't happen. If you go back to, someone told me this story, and here's the evolution of things. When Adlai Stevenson got the nomination, Democratic nomination, and I think it was 52, I think they said. He went out on stage, you know, to accept the nomination, and everybody was like cheering and all that stuff. And one of his campaign people said to his son, "Why don't you go out on stage?" Now, I don't know if it's true or not, but that's the story I heard. "Why don't you go on stage?" And the son went on stage, and there was a big cheering, you know. The father and the son is out there, whatever it may be. And apparently afterwards, Stevenson was furious that the idea of exploiting his kid to get applause and whatever, and thought it was distasteful. And now, look where we are.
Yeah, I've actually, you've said before in interviews about that, the evolution of television and its role in our lives, and that watching Groucho Marx and Quiz Show and the contestants being so uncomfortable, and now everyone's so media savvy. I mean, do you think that's part and parcel of why we're at where we are now? Do you think, is there a downside to this television takeover?
Absolutely. No, absolutely, because everybody's comfortable in front of a television now, as opposed to people who were nervous, you know. It was a whole, it's a big change. So now we're all comfortable, and then the more comfortable you become, then the more casual you become. And now you're saying things casual, but that have enormous significance, you know. And so what happens is it brings everything down. And in the end, I believe that we're going to be facing a very, very difficult future in this regard. Whatever television points the camera at is less good than we thought it was. And what it does is it breaks down dreams. It doesn't create dreams, it breaks down dreams. So everything that you pointed at, the politicians aren't as good as you thought the politicians were. The teachers aren't as good as the teachers that you thought they were. So every institution is less good than what we imagine it to be. And I think that's what we're facing now is, so where are we? So that's why I think there's more disillusionment, because there's nothing to believe in anymore. You know, film was in a sense creating the dreams, and television is the one that basically, you know, kills the dream and shows it as something else. And I think that is going to be very difficult for us as we move into the 21st century. That where do you go when you no longer dream? You're not going to, nobody's going to talk about, you know, it would be when someone would say, you know, one day we're going to have this and we're going to, yes, yes, you know what I mean? There's none of that. We don't aspire to anything anymore. There won't be great programs in terms of projects of the future that it will advance us as a nation. It'll all be pieces of things. So all of the kind of legislation that ultimately advanced from the railroads to the whatever, to the big projects that we took on at one time will never happen again, because we'll beat them to death so that they'll never come to be. And we will only deal with the small minutia, and the grand dreams won't be there and will never be accomplished. So that, to me, is the frightening part of the 21st century, is what happens when dreams die. And that ultimately, I see as a direct result of what television brought about, not with any purpose to do so. It is the nature of the exposure of it all.
Mm. Do you still think it has value as a tool to expose light on certain things?
Well, it does expose light on things, but the exposing the light on something is to say, well, that's not that good, but what are you going to replace it with? Because we don't know how to replace it. It just creates disillusionment. So nothing is as good as we thought it was. That's a hard reality to face up to. So who do you look up to? You know what I mean? If you've got two people running for president and you don't like either one, you know, who do you look up to? You know what I mean? Who are the people? You know what I mean? That's a weird phenomenon. Not that the world was ever great, but it did dream, and it did accomplish a lot. And so we don't digest it that way anymore.
We're going to take a short break. Eat your sandwich.
If that makes